Hello everyone. Today we're diving into the differences between constitutional monarchies and absolute monarchies. Both systems involve monarchs, but they couldn't be more different in how they distribute power. So let's start with constitutional monarchies. A constitutional monarchy is a system where a king or queen exists, but their power is limited by a constitution or a set of laws. In this setup, the monarch's role is largely ceremonial. Take the United Kingdom, for example. Queen Elizabeth II and now King Charles III are symbolic figures who represent the unity and the tradition of the country. But when it comes to real political power, that belongs to Parliament. In a constitutional monarchy, the government is usually run by elected officials. The monarch might have a say in formalities, but they don't make or enforce laws. Japan is another example of a constitutional monarchy. There, the emperor holds an important cultural and historical position. However, Japan's real political power lies in its parliamentary system. And this means the emperor doesn't govern the country in any practical sense. And now let's shift to absolute monarchies. An absolute monarchy is where the monarch has almost complete control over the government and its decisions. Think of Saudi Arabia. King Salman holds immense power in his country, and he controls not only political decisions, but also the judicial and religious aspects of Saudi society. In absolute monarchies, the monarch's authority is not limited by laws or a constitution. Whatever the king or queen decides often becomes the law. In many cases, the ruler is seen as both the head of state and the head of government. And this is in stark contrast to constitutional monarchies, where the government is more democratic and the monarchy's role is symbolic. And another example of an absolute monarchy is Brunei. Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah is the ruler of Brunei, and he wields significant authority over the country. Much like Saudi Arabia, the Sultan in Brunei makes the key political, legal, and economic decisions. Now you might wonder, why does this difference even matter? Well, it comes down to how power is distributed and who holds it. In constitutional monarchies, the power is shared between the monarch and an elected body. And that means checks and balances exist, which can prevent one person or group from having too much control. In absolute monarchies, however, power is concentrated in the hands of one individual. And there's little room for checks or balances, and decision-making is more centralized. So let's talk about the historical context. Constitutional monarchies, as we see them today, evolved over time. In the UK, for instance, monarchs used to have far more power. But events like the Magna Carta and the English Civil War gradually reduced their influence. And now, the monarch's role is mostly symbolic. On the other hand, absolute monarchies have held on to the idea that one person should rule with near total power. And these systems are often based on the belief that the monarch has a divine right to govern. And that's why you see titles like the custodian of the two holy mosques in Saudi Arabia tying the monarchy to religious authority. The longevity of monarchies, both constitutional and absolute, is also worth noting. Constitutional monarchies tend to be more stable in the long run. That's because power is spread out and not focused on a single individual. If a monarch in a constitutional system isn't doing their job well, it doesn't throw the entire government into chaos. In absolute monarchies, the situation is quite different. If the ruler is incompetent or unpopular, the entire system can be at risk. The fate of the nation often hinges on the personality and decision of one individual. And one of the key differences between the two systems is how they handle succession. In constitutional monarchies, succession is usually a well-organized ceremonial process. It's more about maintaining tradition than governing power. In absolute monarchies, however, succession can sometimes be more, let's call it, complex. Since the monarch holds so much power, succession often leads to internal conflicts, especially if there's no clear line of succession. And now let's touch on human rights and freedom for a second. In constitutional monarchies, because they usually have elected governments and rule of law, citizens tend to have more personal freedoms and rights. Laws are passed by elected bodies, and courts can offer checks on government actions. In contrast, in absolute monarchies, personal freedoms are often limited. Because the monarch has so much control, they can limit freedom of speech, assembly, and even religion without much opposition. Saudi Arabia is often criticized for its human rights records, for example. And people in absolute monarchies have fewer avenues for expressing dissent or calling for political change. That's not to say constitutional monarchies are perfect, but the structure tends to allow more room for reform. And now to sum it all up, in constitutional monarchies, power is shared, and the monarch is largely a figurehead. In absolute monarchies, the monarch has almost total control over the government and the country. And both systems have their own histories and advantages and disadvantages. But the key difference lies in how much power one person holds. So next time you hear about a monarchy, think about which category it falls into and how that shapes life in that country. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into political systems. The next video is right here in the end screen.